contract with them to redo all the yard in April.
Okay, let's get started, and we'll start with our prayer.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us fall silent in the presence of God, knowing that we are always in God's presence, but becoming more aware of it at this moment. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together.
Welcome everybody, and wanted to start by making you aware that we are attempting various ways to take this or record this. And for right now, what we're planning to do is just for those who miss the session, they can go back and look at it if they would like to. That's kind of where we are right now. We may expand that, but we don't want to cut down on the ability to share. And if you think people all out there are going to hear what you're going to say, that's a different thing. We have to talk about that later. But right now, what we're doing is just for those people that have been a part of the group, that if they miss something, they would be able to catch up, by participating in it through the video. We don't know if this video is going to work, and so because it's not necessarily that good. So we will see what happens and make an assessment from that. We may need to get something else, better. We just have to see.
May I add something to that?
Do what?
May I add
Yeah,
something?
sure.
So the way we have it set up is that right now it's just looking at Chris. The camera's just on Chris, so it's not on anybody else, in case that's a concern to you. And I'll just out myself that this is a big deal to me. I've been talking about doing this for, I don't know, months. Because I was thinking about what Ms. Jutra said last time about how are other people going to learn about this. And whatever Chris is teaching, in my opinion, we need to be really good stewards of him and his gifts and what he brings here. And so I would love it if we all feel comfortable with it. If at some point it became a way that if you were out of town, like Chris said, you could tune back in and see what happened, or you could do that day. I can't be physically there on Wednesday, I'm homesick, but I can go to watch the class later. So I just feel like it's being good stewards of who we are and the adult formation that's here.
Where
So,
will
I know
you
we won't
watch
say
it
that.
later?
Okay, yeah.
Well, right now, we're going to, we're going to try to put it up on the website. It would be restricted in that sense. We'd get a code for it or something, you know, but we're just trying to see if it'll work. We don't even know that yet. And so we're going to see if it plays back. We're going to see if we can get it on the website. I mean, we're not really there yet.
I was just
so
curious where it would be. Yeah, well.
This probably won't be one of them we share because we're not
right.
sure it's even going to work, you know.
Yeah.
But eventually, we would like to try some different, this is what we have, some equipment we had. And so we were going to try this first to see if it would work. If not, then we can, you know, purchase a nicer thing, you know, nicer camera or whatever. So that's just where we are right now. We'll just see what happens with that. So don't, you know, we're not putting this out to the whole
On
world.
YouTube, yeah.
So, you know, it's kind of but it is, I think it is a way for us to continue to have people that miss to catch up, you know, and not feel like they're have lost something.
Do you have last week's paper?
I do. I forgot to bring them.
Okay.
I will bring them as soon as we're finished. I'll
Next
bring
week?
them.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah, I need to.
You missed it?
Okay. So we're in chapter 7 at this point, going somewhere good. This is kind of the end of the first section that Richard does. And I like this, the very first part where he talks about if Christ in you is the starting point, what is the end goal for all of us, and for that matter, the cosmos in its entirety? Is our late great planet Earth really headed toward Armageddon? And this is a reference that we started with last week, and I have heard at the forum and some other things, and that is to say that for many Christians, the plan is kind of an escape plan. That is to say that God will come, or Jesus will come again and take those righteous people out of the world rather than in the world, you know, or leave them here. So it doesn't matter what happens to the earth, you know, the earth can blow up and everything's fine because I'm going to be up there somewhere. Well, in my opinion, of course, that's kind of a silly plan.
Silly.
I used to believe it, but it's kind of a silly plan. The reason it's a silly plan is because, as Revelation puts it, that what's going to be transformed is heaven on earth, not earth taken to heaven. You know, heaven will come on earth. And this is what it's trying to say is that this is trying to transform humanity into Christ, to be able to see Christ in all things here, you know, in that sense. So that's a different trajectory than some of the more conservative churches have at this point. And so that's a problem with lots of things. As we've talked about at the adult forum, it's a problem with environmental issues, because if you're going to leave the earth, you don't have to worry about what happens. You know, you don't care about future generations because they're going to be raptured up just like you or whatever, you know. So this is a critical paradigm shift for lots of Christians, and not everybody's going to be going along, by the way, but somebody's got to start. You know, you got to get it going in that sense. So that's where I think we are at this point. And Richard Gore, in my opinion, is one of the leaders in this paradigm shift, you know, of helping us to see what's really there that we have largely ignored. And that over and over again you see signs of that. And we start with the image of fire in this first chapter, the second section, the inner process of change. Fire for us is a destructive symbol. And if you know, having your house burn or whatever it might be, you feel that destructive power. But for most of humanity's lifetime, fire is seen as a renewing symbol. The forest has to burn for new life to begin to grow in that sense. And that was kind of a typical understanding that people had for years, that fire is a renewing symbol. And this is, renewal is the kind of the first words that Jesus says. Again, because the church, excuse me, because the church has gotten off onto Paul's, or the Protestant church at least, has gotten off onto Paul's theology, we have missed what Jesus said. And in the last 30 years, or 40 years, we have begun to focus more on Jesus and what Jesus said. And the first thing he said was, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, or the kingdom of God is at hand, depending on which translation you use. Heaven in Matthew's gospel is used because Matthew was a good Jew and didn't want to talk about God or use the sacred name. So he used heaven instead, which means the presence of God. So they mean the same thing. The conservative groups get them mixed up and use them as two different things, but they're really the same thing. And this is really very interesting. I hadn't heard this before. I knew that this had happened, but I wasn't sure how. And that is to say that the word repent is actually the word metanoia in Greek. And the word metanoia, as I've outlined here, the meta is either a preposition beyond or an adjective large. And noia means mind. So metanoia means go beyond the mind or go into the larger mind, whichever you would choose. It can be, looked at both ways. But in the 4th century, St. Jerome translated the word into Latin as penitentia, thank you, which means repent or do penance, initiating a whole different line of what was happening there. It's a moralistic connotation of what we would say is to turn around, to go a different way. Now, that's not wrong, but it doesn't move you up to a different level to see things differently, which is the problem. That is to say that if you're in a traditional consciousness, it just means you need to follow the law rather than not following the law. And that's true, But what Jesus is really saying is to gain a different consciousness, a consciousness that the kingdom is already here, that we're already connected, as we would say today, that we're already one. That's the mind, because once you get that mind, then you begin to treat the world differently automatically, as opposed to just trying to change one attitude or another. This understanding of metanoia has not been around very long. And even though we had many Greek scholars in Virginia Seminary, I never heard this. Of course, it's a Protestant seminary, in that sense. And so it was more in the traditional sense of repenting, which means stop doing the bad things you're doing and do the right things. And again, that's not bad, but that's not really what Jesus said, or what Jesus means by this. He's trying to get us to see that God is already a part of everything, that everything already is one, and that changes kind of the focus of our lives in that sense. That's not easy to handle. I mean, I don't mean to say that that's just automatic, but it's a challenge for us to begin to think differently.
And Kristen, do you think that if once we do go into the larger mind, then a natural consequence would be that you follow the law? see what I mean? Like,
Right.
so then,
Right.
so they're both good. Both translations are fine, it's just going to the larger mind is really the ultimate thing, and then when you do that,
Right.
you do,
Right.
yeah?
Flow
Yeah.
from there.
It kind of explains the why. You know, you have children tell you that, you say, you know, don't cross the street without looking both ways. Why?
Yeah.
Because I don't want you to get run over and killed by a car,
Right.
you know. And you don't want that either. But I mean, it gives you the why of what you're doing. When you see those patterns, that law that defines nature and how it acts, also defines you and how you should act and how you will act or be.
Right. Right. Okay, so as he says in the paragraph in the middle there, faith became about external requirements that could be enforced, punished, and rewarded, much more than actual change of heart or mind, which Jesus describes as something that largely happens in secret, where your Father who sees all that is done in secret can reward you. Again, this is about, you know, seeing different between your actions and your being, a change in those two ways. Jesus invariably emphasizes inner motivation and intention in his moral teaching. He made religion about interior change and purity of heart, not external change, as we would say. And internal change is much more difficult than external change. In religion, many prefer magical, external, one-time transactions instead of the universal pattern of growth and healing through loss and renewal. This universal pattern is the way life perpetuates itself in every new form, ironically, through various kinds of death. And this is actually what this whole chapter is about. And it's really helping us to see that changing an external really doesn't have the same quality of change as changing the internal part. And I would describe it as, for most of us, getting a balance between our left and right brains. You know, that is not just about rational thought, it's also about a sense of heart thought, you know, being a part of things. The right brain kind of connects us, the left brain analyzes us, and we need both of those to operate. But the right brain, the more connecting brain, is necessary for us to be able to do the right thing, so to speak, without having to worry about whether it's right or wrong. God protects us into and through death, just as the Father did with Jesus, the last paragraph there. When this is not made clear, Christianity ends up protecting and idealizing the status quo, or even more, the supposedly wonderful past, at least insofar as it preserves our privilege. Comfortable people tend to see the church as a quaint antique shop where they can worship old things as substitutes for eternal. I've been there too, so you know all about that. And then another statement, this next statement that comes from this second section: there is no such thing as a non-political Christianity. To refuse to critique the system or the status quo is to fully support it, which is a political act well disguised. Jesus was political, and we try to make him not that way. I think his name is John Yoder. Is that right? Yoder's his last name. I can't remember his first name, but wrote a book on the political Jesus, which was just brilliant. And it talks about how he is challenging the political system, not only the Jewish political system, but the Roman political system in all kinds of ways throughout the Bible. You know, when he sees people being enslaved and suppressed and having injustice around, he calls it out, and sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes it's not recognizable, but it's there, you know, just as the prophets did. He is in that line of prophets. The prophets would rail over the leaders of Israel whenever the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. If that happened, they would start talking, and they would challenge the leaders to change. And in fact, when they didn't change, that's when they were sent into exile. And the exile, I think, was God's way of saying, hey, you needed to have listened to these prophets, you know, and they didn't.
But you know, I think nowadays we hear so much more from the people who have this, the religious leaders who have this simplistic view than we do from people like the leaders in our church. And that's not, it's not fair, because it's giving people, especially young people, I worry about the idea that Christianity is about reward, doing the right thing, and making a lot of money, and if you're not this, then you're a bad person. I mean, I just hear things that I think, you know, out of the mouths of religious people, and I think, man, if I were you, I'd start worrying about going to hell. That's just really way off the mark, you know, of what's actually in the Bible. But that's what is being promoted as Christianity, and that bothers me a great deal, because I consider myself a Christian.
Yeah.
But I'm not like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, and I don't know exactly why that's happened.
They have their
but-
own TV station.
Yeah, it may be partially because they're on TV all the time.
Yeah.
And,
Mhm.
you know, their
Right.
voice is out there all the time.
Yeah.
You
Now,
know.
What
I
are you
just-
referring to?
Sometimes you know, maybe it's just an issue that they are using media to put forth their version.
Who are you talking about in actuality? I mean,
People
these-
like Franklin Graham. and-
These evangelists that are
Yeah,
in, that have these
I mean,
mega
there was
churches.
something the other day I read on Facebook that Franklin Graham said that I thought, man, this is just like talk about devil worship. You know, this is really
Unfollow that.
out. You know?
Snooze up.
But
Well,
being
their
quoted
answers-
as not critical, being quoted as truth,
Yeah.
because Franklin
Right.
Graham said it. You know,
Yeah. Well, they,
for
they,
Christians,
they
this is,
give-
you can't be a Christian
they
if you
give
don't.
very
yeah.
simplistic answers to complicated problems.
Uh-huh.
And that's comforting to a lot of people that don't really want to wrestle with the more
But
complicated
it may be
situations.
that they're, and that is easier to give in a sound bite
Mhm.
than this.
And we talk about though the Christians that would be more in line with the way we would think about things. They don't say much. They don't get publicity. In fact, it was probably only Bishop Curry being invited to the royal wedding, and his sermon, that's the first time
That
I've heard
was
anybody
about
say
what?
something rational.
That was about what? What was the sermon about?
Love.
Love.
Yeah.
Love.
And it got tons of publicity,
Yeah.
but it was,
Well, how could you
it
miss it?
was there. But
Yeah.
then
Just all over the
it's
place.
gone now for this.
Mhm.
But you have to remember, he's out of the South.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So,
Yeah.
you know, maybe they got something going right.
They have what?
Very
And he's from the South.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the black, that's so interesting, because that's the cultural difference, I think. Because I remember the time we had several years ago, one of our special services, and we did the Negro spirituals and stuff. I don't think we've ever had a more enthusiastic crowd in the singing of them, you know. And there is a joy in their culture about faith that we, I think we're too dignified or whatever it's all about, I don't know. But, you know, and I think that came through with him, and with all his PhDs and whatever he's got, he hasn't lost that. And it's true with almost any time you hear black.
I think it came as a big shock to the Queen and a few others.
Assistant bishop or whatever, coadjutor or whatever it was, that they honored at the bishop's.
Oh, yeah.
It was so sweet. And I remember one time when I was messing around down there on a committee or something, we had a little lunch, and he came in, we brought our bound bag thing, and he brought his guitar. And, you know, and he sang a couple, and so he too never lost that. And it's interesting.
Well, that is true, and the black tradition in the South is very different than the
Yeah.
white
Yeah,
tradition.
yeah.
And he is from the black tradition in the South with completely wonderful scholarship.
Yes,
You know,
yes,
that's,
exactly.
that's the thing about it. He knows the
But he
whole
never lost
thing
that.
the way we would understand it. But
Mhm,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Going somewhere good means having to go through and with the bad and being unable to hold ourselves above it or apart from it. There's no pedestal of perfect purity to stand on, and striving for it is an ego game anyway. Yet the pilot syndrome, which is washing your hands of things, is quite common among bona fide Christians, often taking the form of excluding those they consider sinners. Such is the illusion of many people attracted to religion, and it's quite popular at many mega churches today. All change is private and interior, and any outer critique of systems, one's privilege, one's nation, or one's religion is out of the question. And again, that's where Protestantism has taken us, and the influence of Protestantism is even in the Roman Catholic Church, I think, at this point. How God keeps creation both good and new. And this is I put in bold that first line. I know some Christians might be hesitant about this, but the helpful word here is evolution. And again, most Christians are afraid of that word and really don't want to talk about that word, but I believe that that's the word that is going to change the church. It takes us to get in touch with how evolution is really what the Bible is saying. You know, it's not just what science says, it's what the Bible is saying. And so as we begin to reflect upon that, I think we get a much better picture of God's actions in the world and how things work, which is what we'll be talking about. This next one, God keeps creating things from the inside out so they are forever yearning, developing, growing, and changing for the good. This is the fire He's cast upon the earth, the generative force implanted in all living things, which grows things both from within, because they are programmed for it, and from without, by taking in sun, food, and water. If we see the eternal Christ mystery as a symbolic alpha point for the beginning of what we call time, we can see that history and evolution indeed have an intelligence, a plan, a trajectory from the very start. Risen Christ, who appears in the middle of history, assures us that God is leading us somewhere good and positive, all crucifixions to the contrary. God has been leading us since the beginning of time, but now God includes us in the process of unfolding. And I put that quote for Romans 8 down there. This I think is where the real edge of Christianity is at this point, and it's to see that this Christ, and we see Christ on the cross crucified as the kind of example of this, that His death and resurrection is not just a one-time thing for Him. It's really a revelation for all of us, because this is the way life works. It is really in the middle of creation, as He says, helping us to see what's right, what's true in that sense, I guess, or what is the way things work. And it has been used as a way out for us. That is to say, Christ did this, we don't have to. And He died for our sins, and thanks be to God. And to some degree that's true.
But we don't have to die.
Yeah.
We can just get a gun.
Yeah. That's an escape back into having things the way we want them, as opposed to the way that God has made them, in that sense. And so it has been a diversion for a long time for us. And to realize that the suffering and the changes and the stuff of life that we all go through is part of life, and it's good. It's part of what we're about, and we'll talk about that some more.
We're gonna wait here until we're sure you're off safely.
What he says, Christ is both the divine radiance at the beginning, the Big Bang, and the divine allure, drawing us into a positive future. We are thus bookended in a personal love, coming from love and moving toward an even more inclusive love. This is Christ Omega. When it says Christ is Alpha and Omega in Revelation, that's what it's saying. That love is the beginning and more love is the end in that sense. That's the direction we're going. Everything that rises does seem to converge. And you think about it, as your consciousness rises, you end up converging. You begin to see the oneness more and more as you begin to have, begin to and see the larger picture of things and become a part of it. The biblical symbol of the universal and the eternal Christ standing at both ends of the cosmic time was intended to assure us that the clear and full trajectory of the world we know is an unfolding of consciousness with all creation grown in this one great act of giving birth. On the next page at the top, Jesus' parables of the reign of God are almost always about finding, discovering, being surprised, experiencing reversals of expectations, changing roles and status. None of these notions are static. They are always about something new and good coming into being. Again, we talk about evolution in three terms. Evolution of the physical world, biological evolution, and human evolution. And what we mean by that is cultural and consciousness evolution. That is to say, if you look at the process in physical evolution and biological evolution and in human consciousness evolution, they're exactly the same. The process is the same. Our evolution in consciousness is much faster than the other, in fact. We've been around as Homo sapiens about 10,000 years. And we have gone through, 5 or 6 levels of consciousness jumps in that sense. And it has made culture much more complex. And we're finally beginning to have a worldview of things because of the internet and all the other kinds of communication and transportation that we have. So that we begin to see that it's one, at least from the world point of view. We're not just separate from somebody across on the other side of the world. We are very much a part of a relationship with them. We're all in relationship together. And you can see it 50 years ago when Apollo 11 landed on the moon and looked back to see this blue ball in the space, we get a different sense of who we are, Again, all of Jesus' work it's not about the status quo. It's about a continual growth, a continual evolution of our lives, from love into more love, as we might put it. We've resisted that sense so much that we've often called it growth in the church, but the word really would be evolution, not growth. We are evolving into something more complex. That's what evolution is.
Doesn't that describe aging as well from a personal perspective? When I read this, I thought about how you really do gain in wisdom and knowing what's important and not as important when you get older. Now that I think about the good old days when I was a child and things like that I did, and I was a very happy I've always been a very happy person. I don't want to return to any of that. I'm okay right where I am. And I'm beginning to see some things that I didn't see then that are important to me, and I've become better at loving. You know, I just think people as they age, they either evolve and grow, or they die.
Yeah.
And so there's
Yeah.
nothing left.
It makes me wonder about
That's
what
right.
you're saying, makes me think about, so, well, assuming you die sort of a natural death, not an accident or tragedy, but then death itself might be the ultimate evolution, ultimate, because we
Right.
say, you know,
Right.
life is changed, not ended for the person who's died. So I wonder,
Life
to what you're
prepares
saying.
you for that. And it's just when I walk in the woods now and see the leaves changing and things going to sleep for the umpteenth time, you know, well, for 70 years now, you've watched it happen. And then the winter when it looks like everything's absolutely dead, and then it comes forth and it all happens right there in front of you. You know, you see it happening every single day. So how can you not have an understanding of that when that time, each part of life has a purpose, and that you're not prepared at some point for moving on to the next part, just like you get prepared to move from being a child to being an adult. I mean, none of it happens all of a sudden, you know.
Yeah. Right, it's
It's
an
a,
evolution.
it's a preparation process. But you know, when you went like from being a child to being a teenager, you thought, man, I can't wait till I'm a teenager and I can drive a car and do all this stuff. You don't want to go back to being a child again. You think that's wonderful that you go. You know, but I wouldn't go back to being a teenager again for $1 million. You know, if they said, you'll be young again, I'd say, no thanks. You know, and I
I
had a
wouldn't go
great
back to
time.
raising teenagers again. That'd be worse. That was worse than being one.
You either grow in it and evolve, or you die inside.
Yeah, right.
One of the two.
And see, I think that's part of the fear that builds up in people who don't grow. You know, that there's a fear that builds up.
The end is coming,
Yeah.
and I want to. They want that love and happiness, but they don't know where it is.
I was just
Yeah,
going to
Jen.
say in response and in concordance with what you've said, is that the biggest thing that teachers do, if the parent is uninterested in the child or does deleterious things to the child, that's why the school is so important, because that gives the child a sense of purpose and place. And very often, in very poor countries, there's just not enough of that happening, or I should say poor districts worldwide, because the poverty is what causes the loss of that parent's desire to do the right thing for their child,
They're given
because
up.
no one's done the right thing for them. So they've only learned one pattern. And the real pattern ought to be this love that we're sitting around the table talking about. How do we decide when that happens to the individual? I'm still struggling with that. When does God trust us enough to inflame us about loving and caring for other people?
Because there are some people who live in that kind of poverty that don't feel that way.
Yeah, that's what
They
I'm
do
saying.
learn
Oh,
love.
yeah.
For-
And black people in America are a
Yeah.
good example of that. If anybody had a reason to give up and to hate the whole
Okay.
world, that was a group that did.
And yet so many of them have, and have found.
Yes, and
have
others have
have
not.
followed people like Martin Luther King, and have forgiven those who have lynched their children. And how do you do that? I don't think, I don't know, I couldn't do that. But I am saying that there are people out there who at some point, something happens in this relationship between God and love, and human and despair. If you can cut like this way. And what is that all about? Where does that come from?
That's what I think the generative force is, and that paragraph on the prior page. I mean, for so many years I've been trying to figure out a way to put that concept into a couple simple words.
Which
I mean,
page
What are
is
you
this?
pointing to there?
on page 2, the middle paragraph under the bold,
Yeah.
where it's
God keeps creating things from the inside out.
forever yearning, developing, growing, changing for the good, the generative force. Because exactly what you're describing, to me, I think is a mystery. But I think it is that generative force that's inside every one of us. And that's why people grow, why they change, why they are able to forgive, why they, I mean, it's the only thing that has ever made sense to me, but I really see it and believe it too.
But what sparks it?
But that's what you're right at the same time. What? Yeah.
The Big
Why does
Bang.
it work?
The Big
sometimes?
Bang sparked it. It's
Yeah.
it's our stardust that's in each one of us when we're born.
Right. It's
I
that
mean-
faith and hope that are that part of that outgrowing of
But
love.
some people, the point is, some people
Yeah.
don't, they don't seem to, I mean, I've seen some miserable people, and they hate people, and they do wanna hurt them.
And I think the only way to really conquer despair, depression, maybe fear of death, is when you can step outside of yourself to help somebody else. I mean, it can be your neighbor, it doesn't mean foreign missionary work, which would be great too, but just,
Mhm.
Well, it's the concept in AA,
yes,
that you're not gonna get better till you begin to help someone else.
the only way you
And
can
any
get better.
kind of thing like that.
Or I think for them, it's to actually feel love.
Yeah.
We saw this thing on the news the other day, a report, and they said the school actually wanted to suppress it, of a student who came to school with a rifle. And he came and they saw him,
Coach
and what he intended to do was kill himself. And a coach
Coach took the gun away from him.
saw it, took the rifle from him, and gave him a hug. And the kid just broke down crying.
Yeah.
He said, "I love you, and I don't want you to do this," and stayed with him till they could get him some help.
It's the only way you can help broken
And
people.
instead of saying you violated the code,
Right.
kicked out of school for the rest of your life now.
Right.
Yeah, so I think I think too, like the question I see coming up is kind of like, why does it, why does it actually happen that at some point in time, the forces come together and someone changes or can go towards that generative force? And I guess the other piece for me is also, but it's never that it won't happen for somebody. That it's like, that I don't think that in anyone, we could never say about a human is, oh, they're just so angry, they're so bitter. I don't see it that way. I think humans into our 80s or into our whatever period of our lives that I would never say change can't happen. And so I guess I hold on to that.
I think everybody can, and
Yeah.
I think Richard Lawrence even said, everybody does. Before they die, everybody does finally come
Yeah.
to that realization,
Yes, really
and that's why
that.
he says there's no hell, and
Yeah.
which is wonderful.
Like
I'm really quick because I know I used to be a criminal prosecutor, and I have to tell you, with all the interviews I ever did with criminals and victims too, but with the criminals, we'd interview them to try to get confessions, and people have asked, "My God, that person did such and such, how could you even get in a cell with them?" Every single one, I never met one who you couldn't actually see the humanity in them. And with what they've done, it's been, my God, interviewing a man who killed his child, well, not his child, but his girlfriend's child, and I thought, God, that is really about as bad as it gets. It was brutal killing. And then I had kids, and I'm living in Kenilworth, wonderful husband, no financial worries really, and boy, I thought, I can't believe there aren't more murders, because when everything is going right, kids can take you down. And I thought, man, I'm glad I was never hard on them and mean to offenders, because you have to understand how it all happens, and I think we all can. And I
And
just,
see, that's part of the raising of consciousness.
Right.
Rather than seeing it as a broken rule and they're bad,
right.
Yeah.
it's really
simple.
that's
We all have to
a
See,
greater
I wasn't a criminal
understanding of
prosecutor,
people.
but I've taught
Yeah.
the bad boys and girls in school. They go say, the children with emotional, the ones that
Yeah.
brought guns to school.
Right.
And they say, I don't know what she's doing in there, but she's not sending them to my office.
Yeah.
And I was just laughing at them.
And that's the only way you can help them
And-
find
And
their
understanding
place.
that here I am in my
Right.
nice clothes and shoes and matching
Yeah,
bag. and purse.
I get it.
And
I
they
know
have,
I
they
have.
have nothing.
Right.
Nothing.
In fact, this one guy I took a confession from, I saw him afterwards and he told me, thank you. When you get up on the stand, you didn't lie about me. Because he had done a bunch of horrible stuff. He admitted a few things. And I told, this is what he told me, this is it. No, well, he didn't do da-da-da. He didn't tell you he did that. I'm like, no, he did not. He told me he did this. And he assumed I was going to lie and say, oh yeah, he did this. And I was like, wow. The guy never, he never had anybody that told him the truth. It's just so sad. I'm a cat.
Okay, let's move on to section 4. Cardinal John Henry Newman, to live is to change and to be perfect is to have changed often. Good quote. Anything called good news needs to reveal a universal pattern that can be relied upon and not just clannish or tribal patterns that might be true on occasion. This is probably why Christianity's break with ethnic Judaism was inevitable, although never intended by either Jesus or Paul, and why the early second century Christians were already calling themselves Catholics or the Universals. Catholic really means the whole, and that's what that came out of the death and resurrection of Jesus, was this sense of wholeness, of oneness together, and it lasted for a while and then kind of got sidetracked. Yet after Jesus and Paul, except for occasional theologians, the most widely accepted version of Christianity has little to do with the cosmos or creation, nature, or even history. Without a universal storyline that offers grace and caring for all creation, Jesus is kept small and seemingly inept. God's care must be toward all creatures, or God ends up not being very caring at all, making things like water, trees, animals, and history itself accidental, trivial, or disposal. What if we just recovered this sense of God's inherent grace as the primary generator of all life, and that it does its job from the inside out? That's what is true. Yeah, that's what is true. Traces of goodness. The evolutionists rightly want to say the universe is unfolding, while believers can rightly insist on the personal meaning of that unfolding, to give the phenomenon of life and matter a positive and certain endpoint, which we call resurrection, while also accounting for lots of suffering and death along the way, which we call crucifixion. Again, this is the pattern that you see in nature, dying and rising. The plants are growing because of all the dead plants and animals that came before it. It's the process of suffering and change, and it's part of the pattern of life. Yet to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead is actually not a leap of faith. Resurrection and renewal are in fact a universal and observable pattern of everything. Every time you take a breath, you're repeating the pattern of taking spirit into matter, and thus repeating the first creation of Adam. And every time you breathe out, you're repeating the pattern of returning spirit to the material universe. In a way, every exaltation is a little dying, as we exhalation is a little dying, as we pay the price of inspiriting the world. Your simple breathing models your entire vocation as a human being. You are an incarnation like Christ, of matter and spirit operating as one. Risen Christ is not a one-time miracle, but the revelation of a universal pattern that is hard to see in the short run. True Christianity and true science are both transformational worldviews that place growth and development at their center. both endeavors, each in its own way, cooperate with some divine plan. Whether God is formally acknowledged may not be that important. Again, what he's trying to say in all this is that this universal pattern of death and resurrection is the way everything works, is the way evolution works, it's the way our growth works, it's the way everything is. Look in the, so if you don't have much time, if you look at the page 5, I'd like to get to talk about this for a few minutes at least. In Appendix 2 in the back of the book that he mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, page 243 to 248, he outlines this pattern of death and resurrection as order, disorder, and reorder. Order, and again, as we've been talking about, for those who don't have the basic needs provided, this stable order is not really everybody is attuned to. You don't necessarily get this if you don't have your basic needs fulfilled in a sense. But order is the time when everything is kind of innocent, everything, your first naivete, as he puts it, when you're a child and you have plenty of nurturing around you. That would be one way of thinking about order. But order continues for most people who have their basic needs, fulfilled. But then times of disorder, that is disappointments, your failures, if you're honest with you, the things you mess up, and so forth. But then, and this is Leonard Cohen from one of his songs, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. This is a necessary step in life. And so you reorder. And what that means really is you don't go back to the naive order that you had, but you begin to complexify your life in such a way that you begin to see a larger life. These, in the Bible, Exodus and exile, or return from exile and freedom from slavery, the two main death and resurrection patterns that we see. Others see it in nirvana, enlightenment, there are other names for it, springtime, and so forth. And then I want to talk about a chapter in Ronald Rolhauser's book, Holy Longing. And this is what he calls the spirituality of the Paschal Mystery. The Paschal Mystery means the Passover mystery. And we often get that mixed up when we talk about the angel of death passing over and the Israelites who have, or the Jewish people who have their doors marked with blood, passing over those, and we leave it at that. But what this is about really is the angel of death passing over as they escape and they come into freedom and into a new life. This is the Passover mystery, that from slavery to freedom. And the freedom, if you understand, is not a freedom to do whatever you want to do. It is a freedom of living in community with God. And this is what the covenant community is about. So they're coming from being slaves in a community where some people lord it over others, so to speak. They come out of that and are free to be in community together. And that's what the Ten Commandments are really trying to about. They're about how you live together in right relationship with God and one another. It's the beginning of what we would call the covenant community. So the Paschal mystery is the same thing as we would say is the Christ mystery, because the Paschal mystery is the Greek word for Passover. It is what the early Christians called the death and resurrection of Jesus, is the Paschal mystery. But it's not just the Paschal mystery in the sense of death of Jesus, death and resurrection of Jesus. It is a reflection upon all the Paschal mysteries that we go through, all the Christ mysteries, like the Exodus story, Also like the exile, where God brings them out of exile and back home again. These are all Christ mysteries, or Paschal mysteries in that sense. And if you think about your life, as Libby was talking about earlier and some others, about growth and about the evolution of yourself, you go through the Paschal mystery, the Christ mystery, yourself, whether you want to or not. You know, when you move from a child to an adolescent, you going through the Paschal mystery. You're letting go of an old life and you're taking hold of a new life. And as Ronald Rollhauser points out, and this is, I think, very provocative, that if you look at the pattern of the church's celebration of Easter, you will see that pattern. And it's a pattern that Jesus went through, but it's also the pattern we go through anytime we do something. Like, for instance, Good Friday is the loss of childhood. Okay? Easter Sunday is the reception of adolescence. The 40 days is the adjustment for that. If you remember your time in those times, while you were an adolescent, your physical body changed and so forth, but you still wanted to be a child occasionally. You know, you still wanted to go back to the old way. But at some point in time, there was an ascension, a letting go of the old and letting it bless you, so that you actually became an adolescent, a real adolescent, whatever that means. You know. And Pentecost is a reception of the new spirit for that new life. The spirit of being that adolescent. And you can do this for all the stages, whether it's adolescent to adulthood, adulthood to being married to having children, and letting those children go off to college, going from that to having grandchildren, and so forth. Every stage can be seen that way. You know, you die, you receive a new life, you struggle with that new life. At some point in time, and this happens in lots of different ways, you let go of that old life, and then to receive the Spirit for a new life. In that sense. This is a pattern you see in everything. Every transition. You move to a new town, you go to the same thing. You move to a new house in a new neighborhood, you go through the same pattern. You have someone close to you die, you go through that same pattern. We go through that pattern when we talk about God in a different way than you've thought about God before. You go through that same pattern in order to take hold of that new way. The pattern is in life everywhere. We use this in real spirituality as one of the ways of looking at movies. And you look at a movie like It's a Wonderful Life, which most people know. That the pattern is perfect in that movie. You know, that George Bailey has this dream of being an engineer and building bridges, but his father dies, and it's Good Friday for him because he's got to stay home with the savings and loan. A few days later, though, his new life comes along and Mary, and they get married. But he still hasn't let go of the old dreams. He wants his brother to take over the thing. But his brother comes back already married and he can't do it. And so he loses it. He gets into trouble with the loss of money by his uncle. And he faces, a death there when the angel comes to help him in that sense. And then he has an ascension, really, at that point. Where he begins to see that his life really is good the way that it's been. It's wonderful, in fact. And so him racing back home and being with his family is the new spirit. You know, you see though that pattern in lots of movies, mainly because it's a pattern of life in that sense. So this is death and resurrection is a part of everything. Now, before we go, I want to talk about the evolutionary study of this as well. there are 5 major extinctions in the biological past, and the last one was called the Cretaceous Tertiary 165 million years ago. This one is particularly important to us. What happened was India, which the more or less basically the country of India, or the continent of India as it says, pushed up against Asia at a fault line, and the tectonic plate movement. Lots of volcanic activity began to occur at that point, and then, to top it off, a giant meteorite hit Yucatan Peninsula, and the whole world was clouded with volcanic dust and a mess, and it changed the climate so much that all the dinosaurs died, but the mammals did not. And that's why we're here. Because as long as the dinosaurs were around, we had no place. But so there's a death and a resurrection. Everything is that way. Most of you came here in a car. That is death and resurrection working for you. Petroleum is nothing but dead plants and animals a million years ago. Oil in there that keeps it running. And the iron comes from an explosive supernova star. And all the elements come from that. So your car is there because of the death of a star and the death of a lot of plants and animals. And it is what part of that that's made us who we are today. But that's everything is about death and resurrection. And if you think about all of it, it's that most of the complexity of life, our own brains, have come from some sort of death and resurrection in that sense, because that's the biological resurrection. It's not allowing things to go back the way they were. It's always a progression of more complexity. And that's where I hope we're going. Complexity of seeing and believing and trusting that we are one and acting upon it. Okay, thank you.
That was great.
See you next week.
Donald,